Hello and welcome to the Better Without Billboards podcast. I'm Nicola from Ad Free Cities, and today we're talking about advertising and cultural values. Now, we know that adverts we see every day are constantly influencing our choices, often without us being aware. But adverts are also shaping what we perceive to be important and our attitudes to social and environmental issues through appealing to certain cultural values. Advertisers may be doing this unintentionally, but the effect is powerful and can undermine progress towards social and environmental change. So for this episode, I spoke to narrative strategist Ruth Taylor about the relationship between advertising and cultural values. I invited Ruth to analyse some big brand adverts, including from Pepsi and Apple, which seemed to appeal to values of caring for nature and social unity. And we discussed how this might affect us. Ruth also offers her recommendations for how the ad industry needs to change if they genuinely want to promote such values. I'll tell you a bit more about Ruth before we hear the interview. Through her work with the Common Cause Foundation, Ruth Taylor helps a broad range of organisations to recognise and shift what she calls their cultural values footprint. We'll go into what this means in our conversation. Ruth is also a freelance narrative and cultural strategist, working with organisations to understand, apply and evaluate narrative and cultural change practices. Ruth has been working in the field of social change for the past 10 years, namely in public engagement and campaign strategy roles for organisations like Amnesty International and Restless Development. She is particularly interested in narrative change and writes a fortnightly newsletter called Culture Soup that collates the latest thinking in this field. So let's hear that conversation with Ruth now. Ruth, welcome to the Better Without Billboards podcast. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm excited for the conversation.
Now, Ruth, let's dive in. Your work looks at cultural values. Now, that's a term which might conjure up a lot of different things for different people. So can you start by explaining what do you mean by cultural values and why are they important?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's sometimes a term that I refer to as quite flabby. When you hear that word, lots can be kind of packed into that word. So when you hear the term cultural values, your brain can kind of go off in lots of different directions. Most commonly, people tend to think, they hear the term cultural values and they think of kind of organizational cultures, the cultures that exist within companies. So they go down the kind of pathway of thinking about values as a set of core beliefs that define what a company believes in and that is supposed to be sort of directing its practice. That's different to the way that we talk about cultural values. When we at Common Cause talk about cultural values, we're meaning the principles or the standards which influence how we individually or collectively make decisions about what is important in the world. And cultural values are, we're sort of immersed in them. So in the way that we each exist in a dominant culture, that culture has particular values that it prioritizes. And we as citizens are reminded of those values all the time throughout our day-to-day experiences, that can be in very, very subtle ways or not so subtle ways. So the messaging that we receive. So this is like the content that we consume, the experiences that we're having with public institutions, the conversations we're having with friends and family, political rhetoric we hear, and of course the advertising that we are all surrounded by constantly. And these sort of messages, they kind of add up to what we think as being desirable in the world. So obviously this has a huge impact on how we as individual human beings and as groups of human beings come to think about social and environmental injustice. Do we as a group prioritise wealth and power and public image and status, or are we prioritising, flourishing nature, community well-being, time spent with our loved ones, etc.? So the cultural values that are surrounding us all the time go some way as to motivating or suppressing public appetite and demand for a different way of living together on this planet. When we talk about cultural values, there are two kind of groups of values that are very important. One being extrinsic values. Those are values which seek they sort of depend on external approval or reward. So these are things like individual popularity, wealth, status, kind of image. And then there's a group of values called intrinsic values that are about, they feel much more inherently rewarding to us. They're things like creativity, concern over the well-being of your loved ones, community, unity with nature, etc. And so Common Cause's work, our sort of assessment, if you like, is that we live in a world that is prioritizing extrinsic values hugely. That's the sort of waters that we're all swimming in all the time. And what can we do? The question of how do we go about co-creating and sustaining a culture, a different shared way of life, which actually foregrounds and champions and continues to strengthen intrinsic values, the values on which a kind of flourishing planet kind of depends.
Can you tell us a bit more about how extrinsic and possibly intrinsic values as well, how do these show up in advertising?
They absolutely do. Nearly all experiences that we have, all of the kind of content that we consume or are exposed to, engages values for us. Often really subconsciously. It's not things we're thinking about particularly at the forefront of our mind. I like to think of values as kind of light bulbs in our head. As we sort of go about in our day-to-day experiences, these little light bulbs kind of ping as our attention is drawn to a particular value. There's a bit of a misconception that as human beings, we have sort of fairly static values that I'm someone who just has quite liberal values and somebody else just has more conservative values, etc. That's a bit of a misconception. Human beings are far more complicated than that. We have a real range of values. Some are more important to us than others. So some might be called dispositional values, the values that that are very important to us and that we gravitate to again and again and again. And those are often formed in our childhood, in our kind of early years. But other values are also what's called primable. Our attention can kind of be drawn to that value. We can be reminded in a moment that we also hold that value to a particular extent. So if I give you an example, my dispositional values are often values that we might describe as kind of universalism or benevolence. The career I've had, is probably founded on this sense that the values that I hold to be really important are about equality and justice and protecting the environment, etc. And yet I still hold the value of wealth to a certain extent. If I go to my local shop now to pick up some bread, I'll see a poster for the Euro Millions. And I will then start daydreaming about, what shall I do with my £100 million lottery winning? Like, how many yachts shall I buy, etc. I'm human. That's still a value that I hold to a certain extent. And similarly, if I was somebody who actually really prioritized things like wealth and status and power, etc., I still hold a value of protecting the environment to a certain extent. So if I'm sitting there and I'm watching a gorgeous sunset and you feel that sense of awe, you feel that sense of connection to this much larger ecosystem, that's a moment where you're reconnecting with a different value that maybe you don't spend your life prioritizing. So advertising is a key primer of values. It's engaging values in us, either intentionally or unintentionally. And the thing about values is that they strengthen. The more that you're being exposed to them, the kind of more weight you're placing on that kind of group of values. So lots of advertising, either very explicitly or implicitly, is strengthening our extrinsic values. It's encouraging us to buy stuff. It normally kind of has a kind of storyline that says something like, you should feel insecure about X. Now we can provide you with the answer to sort of solve that insecurity. So, buy this iPhone, or take this diet pill to lose more weight, or get this car, etc., etc. So it's normally quite explicit, or it's quite subtle. So say you're watching an advert and it has a particular celebrity. Maybe it's not for a product which is particularly expensive to buy, but your kind of subtle recognition is of this is somebody who has a lot of money, who sort of represents this kind of celebrity consumerist culture. And so there's this like subtle priming of your extrinsic values. It's interesting though, we do sort of live in a bit of an upside down reality now where businesses are making the social and environmental case and charities and NGOs are making the business case for change. So it's a strange situation in which we find ourselves where more and more advertising is trying to strengthen intrinsic values. And maybe we can come on to unpacking why that still might be a problem for us in the sort of social injustice field.
Your comment then about this sort of idea of celebrity and glamour makes me think of a couple of examples. I think a lot about perfume advertising. So perfume being this product which they can't really give you any kind of experience of through an advert. So they're really just selling you an idea. And I think perfume adverts tend to be this kind of ultimate example of selling glamour and celebrity and wealth through advertising, right? The adverts that we see on billboards and cinema screens and TV for perfume. I'm also thinking about this recent advert that McDonald's did with Stormzy, which caused a lot of backlash. I don't know if you saw that. This totally selling this idea of coolness and being like Stormzy, and actually they'd gone really off their usual branding for it as well, which was really interesting.
Yeah, it's such a powerful way of selling a product. I mean, most advertising exists on this. They're trying to tell you that in one way or another, you are not good enough. The life that you have is not good enough. You need to, need to buy something in order to improve it. And so whether that's a product, your life is going to be better if you have the new iPhone, versus something about you. You need to be cooler. You're not good enough as you are. You need to, come to McDonald's and you're going to be cooler somehow. That's the kind of subtle underlying message. And we're not thinking about it very consciously very often, but those are the values that it's strengthening for us. To be cool is one of the most important things that we can be in the kind of world of advertising.
So let's look at some adverts, shall we? Now, in our last episode of the podcast, my co-host James spoke to Tolmea Gregory of Clean Creatives about the advertising industry. Clean Creatives have really impressively managed to get over 1,000 ad agencies, mainly smaller ones, committing to not doing any work with fossil fuel clients, which is a fantastic achievement. It's really great progress. I think it's a good signal that there are ad creatives who want to reject work for polluting industries. And we know that there are other initiatives too, which are attempting to improve the ethics of the advertising industry. So I wanted to talk more about cultural values and how advertisers are engaging these and how they're apparently using their powers for good, so to say. So can they promote things we genuinely need to help us thrive, to encourage us to care for each other, to care for nature? We do often see advertisers appearing to do this. And so, yeah, I thought we could have a conversation about where this is, can this be a positive thing? Where do we need to be wary of the motives of such adverts? So I shared with you a couple of examples before this, for our call, Ruth, and for our listeners, I'll put links to these examples in the show notes so they can have a look. But just to kick off then, in a previous episode 2 of season 2, I believe, James and I looked at an advert for a Volvo SUV, which we talked about in some detail in that episode, but it basically plays on a father's love for his unborn daughter and the need to keep your family safe to sell SUVs. And I'm interested to know your thoughts about this. I mean, it's clearly an example of using these intrinsic values to sell cars, right? And makes me feel very cynical about the motives. What are your thoughts, Ruth?
Yeah, it's a powerful advert. It's emotive. It really tells you a story. I think it's really interesting that it actually spends very little time showing you the car. It's much more invested in the storytelling. So in terms of values, what I think is happening in this advert is that it engages what we would call your benevolence values. So your benevolence values are the values that are that you hold because of a concern that you feel for the well-being of your loved ones or the people that you are in frequent contact with, what a psychologist might call your in-group. And these values are immensely important to the vast majority of people. So in the UK, for example, about 76% of the UK population really prioritise benevolence values. And across the world, this comes out in the kind of values research. And it's probably not surprising. When you think about it, your love for your friends and your family are a driving force for the vast majority of us. So it's a clever and powerful group of values to decide that you want to tap into, because there aren't really many groups of people that aren't going to feel an emotional reaction to those values being engaged. What it then kind of does is quite sneaky and manipulative, I feel. It kind of pivots you, it moves you into thinking about insecurity. So it gives a sort of threatening message. You love your loved ones. Wouldn't it be terrible if something awful happened to them? Oh, you should buy this car. It tries to create a problem for you and then solve that problem by saying you can buy this car. That problem can go because you have this big, powerful car. It's a false promise, obviously. There's no way that car means that you are not going to risk, tragedy in your life. And so it's tapping into a level of manipulation that I think is really quite disgusting, if I'm honest. It plays on the love that you have for people, and then sort of threatens you. So it's although I can imagine that the advertisers who are working on that advert looked at the safety features of that car and then thought, how amazing, people might be able to kind of protect their loved ones better. I can imagine that's something that people would feel strongly about. And so that is the route that we're going to take. That's the framing of the advert that we're going to lean into. I'm sure they weren't doing it with a kind of like, I would like to manipulate people through fear that their loved ones are going to be hurt somehow into buying this car. But that is what happens on a kind of psychological level. And at the end of the day, you can't really get around the fact that if we keep buying cars and driving cars to the extent that we do, there will not be a livable planet for anyone to be safe in, regardless of whether you know them personally or not.
It is clearly very effective, isn't it? And if you have a look at the comments beneath that advert video on YouTube, people are incredibly moved by this advert, particularly fathers. Have expressed real kind of a really deep emotional response to the advert. It really shows how powerful those messages were. Now, Ruth, the idea of advertisers using intrinsic values is not new, right? I'm thinking of that classic Coca-Cola advert from the 1970s. I'd like to teach the world to sing. I'd like to buy the world a Coke, which promotes this beautiful message of love and harmony, but is about selling a caffeinated, sugary, fizzy drink to us. Now, fast forward 50 years from that, and you get this interesting example of a few years ago of a Pepsi ad. Again, we'll put this in the show notes so people can have a look, but listeners might remember this. This Pepsi ad promoted a message of unity and harmony among police and protesters, with the model Kendall Jenner featuring in it, who offers a Pepsi to one of the police officers. Now, at the time, this ad was massively criticised. People said it trivialised the aims of social justice movements and protest, and it made light of the conflict that was happening at the time and still does, of course, between demonstrators and police. To me, this feels like quite a clear echo of that Coke advert from decades beforehand, that this branded drink is kind of promoted as delivering this message of peace and harmony. So Pepsi pulled the ad, and I'll tell you what they said. They said Pepsi was trying to project a global message of unity, peace and understanding. Clearly, we missed the mark and we apologise. Now, look, if we're being kind, we might say, is that a case of Pepsi just overestimating their own influence beyond that of just selling unhealthy fizzy drinks? If we're being more cynical, we might say, is this a ploy to tap into the current mood and current kind of social causes to generate sales? I'm really interested to hear what you think about this, Ruth. What's your take?
Yeah, so again, I can't imagine that the group of like creatives that were sitting around that table designing that advert felt that they were doing something horrible. I can imagine that they were thinking, reading the room, they're reading kind of what was happening in the culture and being like, this is a moment for this message to come through. I feel like there's probably a deep philosophical conversation to be having about that, about like when we're sort of co-opting messages of justice to at a particular time, like, oh, this feels like this is a moment where this type of conversation is happening, so we could use it, instead of it being truly generated from a feeling of wanting to advocate for unity. In terms of the values itself, so there's lots of criticism of kind of advertising firms who decide that they're going to advertise using extrinsic values. We know this kind of this strengthening effect of the more that we're kind of constantly being referred to the importance of an extrinsic value, the more likely it is that we as individuals come to place kind of greater attachment onto those values, which then is reflected in the way that we show up and act in the world. So there's tons of criticism for advertisers acting in that way. And so I can totally imagine why advertisers might then think, oh, okay, well, we will sell our products through utilising intrinsic values. We'll speak to things like justice and care and community and kindness, etc. Unfortunately, that doesn't work either when it comes to advertising. So there's research that I mean, this is a very live area of research too, which makes it very interesting. There's lots of papers that now sort of talk about the kind of negative downstream consequences of attaching an intrinsic values still to a sort of profit or a business reputation type of motivation. So if I give you an example, McDonald's adverts, they tend to be very focused on family. They reach in, they try to tap into these benevolent values. They show, a happy family sitting down together to eat a meal, and everyone's smiling and happy, and they're enjoying kind of, precious family time. And then, so if I'm watching that advert and I'm like, oh, I love my family, I'd like to have that experience, I take my family off to McDonald's. What happens is we eat really rubbish food, and it's like fluorescent lighting, and children are throwing chips everywhere, and it's really noisy and overstimulating. And instead of thinking, I feel like McDonald's lied to me here, what happens is I decide that I should put less onus, I should put less importance on my benevolent values. So there is a kind of actual kind of cost of advertisers who are ultimately, seeking profit, the profit maximization or a type of reputational management, that it can actually undermine the importance, the prioritization that we each are placing on the intrinsic values that they are then referring to. So in terms of that Pepsi ad, that's exactly what happens. And a lot of the time that, you might not have a kind of conscious reaction. You might not be able to identify exactly what has happened when you watch the McDonald's advert. With the Pepsi advert, it was so overtly obvious what they were trying to do that people really responded badly. And as they should have. It was a very badly misjudged kind of advert. So really, if an advertising agency are wanting to utilise intrinsic values in order to sell a product, they need to get better at walking the talk. They have to live. They have to design their organisations. Their actions of that organisations have to speak to those intrinsic values, and that's very hard to do when you are selling consumerism, when you're selling extraction, when you're selling this sense that you are somehow not good enough and so need to buy other things. There is a kind of a real tension between those two realities, which makes this really difficult. The only way I think that advertisers are able to step into that space better is to take on actual cost. They earn less money because they are doing actions which uphold and align with those intrinsic values. The often quoted example is Patagonia, kind of discouraging customers from purchasing replacements of its jackets and offering to repair them when they need to be repaired. There's a conversation there about reputational management and is your kind of brand identity then linked to intrinsic values? Ideally, they'd also just be selling far less and making far less. So yeah, really, if intrinsic values, if advertising is wanting to strengthen intrinsic values, it also has to think about the what it is willing to change about its practice to live in alignment with those values.
Now that, I think, brings us very neatly onto the final example that I wanted to have a look at, which is an online video from Apple released a couple of years ago. Now this shows, again, we'll share this in the show notes, but just a brief description. The advert shows a boardroom of Apple execs kind of nervously awaiting the arrival of somebody who turns out to be Mother Nature personified, who walks into the boardroom and asks for an update on Apple's progress towards sustainability goals, towards net zero. And the people in the boardroom sort of nervously talk her through all these innovations that they've been making. And ultimately Mother Nature gives Apple her approval and leaves and says, I'll see you next year. This video it's quite long. It's about 5 minutes long. It's obviously been quite successful. It's had 5.3 million views on YouTube. Ruth, is this just greenwash? And what do you think the effect is of this, of a company like Apple promoting themselves as like guardians of Mother Nature?
Yeah, I'd not seen this advert before, and I found it absolutely fascinating for a couple of reasons. And it is quite nuanced. So there's, if I wasn't being particularly skeptical, if I didn't have a background in this sort of work, I can imagine I would have appreciated that video. I think it helps us individually with a degree of cognitive dissonance that we have. This sense of like, I really want the new iPhone, but I am aware that we are really damaging our climate. Even if I'm, nowhere near the climate space, that has seeped through to me that the climate crisis is real, etc. I'm conscious of it, but I still really want the new iPhone. So this advert is a brilliant way of me being able to be like, oh, I can have both. And that's exactly what they were trying to do. You can still buy Apple products. We're doing all of this amazing stuff. By this year, like all of the products are going to be carbon neutral, etc., etc. Like it's solely about materials. It's not about the mentality that we inhabit that keeps us wanting to extract from the planet. So it's a classic advert of modern times, which is saying you can have it all. We are going to continue on this progress train forevermore, but we can do so in a way that isn't going to fundamentally ruin our one and only home. What I found interesting as well was that there is a deep narrative that we sort of hold in our culture that we are somehow separate from nature, that we're not part of it, we are separate, and that it's something that is kind of out there and it's dangerous to us and we need to control it. We need to sort of bring it to heel. And that I just found was completely personified in this sort of pretend meeting that was happening between Mother Nature and the colleagues at Apple. There was this real sense of like they were a bit scared of her. They felt like they needed to sort of prove themselves, etc. It sort of it bakes in this idea that we as human beings have no control. We're kind of like at the whim of nature, and how that strengthens this sense that we need to harness it somehow. We have to sort of like, we need to be able to turn nature into what is most useful for us. So I think although it's saying we are protecting the environment, like we are thinking really carefully about our carbon footprint, the underlying message isn't that. The underlying message is one of we can continue to extract, we can continue to create kind of undefinable amounts of harm for our planet so that people can continue to buy Apple products. They can continue to buy into this dream of human beings we are nothing unless we have the latest stuff. And I think it's something, it comes out really palpably, I think, in that advert, that there's this kind of separation between us, in that advert, the kind of personified by the Apple staff, and nature, that we are not one and the same thing, which I think if we had a different mindset when it came to that, we'd be in a really different place to think about how we tackle the climate crisis. So it's an incredible advert to analyze from this point of view, and I think it really made me feel that I wish there was kind of more literacy out there to sort of dissect these sorts of messages that we're surrounded by all the time.
Yes, and nowhere in that advert is there any suggestion that Apple might stop extracting so much from nature and actually produce and sell less stuff, which presumably is what Mother Nature, were we able to ask her, would really want them to do. But no, that's nowhere, of course. So, Ruth, you've touched on this a little bit. I'd like to ask you a little bit more about what do you think the advertising industry should do in that case? What would be your message for the advertising industry?
Yeah, it's a brilliant question. Completely coincidentally, I was giving a guest lecture at the University of Kent yesterday, and at the end of the session, a student came up to me and said, I really want to go into advertising, but I really want to work for an ethical advertising agency. Like, do you have any suggestions? Who should I contact? And I was a bit stumped, to be honest, because there is something, advertising exists to sell products. It exists to create that desire, because we would not be able to keep our capitalist economy running if we only actually bought the things that we need. So it creates that desire within us. And there is something deeply extrinsic about that, and deeply extractive and consumerist. So I can totally understand why there are people in one camp who are just like, advertising can never be saved. It can never be a beacon of intrinsic values. It can never be a beacon of social justice and environmental protection. Fundamentally, its very foundations are one that are linked to the status quo, the power order that we exist in, and the extrinsic values that relies on. I think for me, there's two conversations that I'd like to see happen within the advertising space. One being, I'd like to see the conversation that is happening, which I applaud and I do think is important. And I know people that work in the advertising space who are really grappling with their own personal values, often the things that drive them, and then the kind of the footprint, the influence that their job is having on the world. And that is deeply painful for lots of individuals. And so I applaud them for having this conversation about how is it possible to make the advertising industry kind of more ethical. What I would like to see happen is I'd like to see that conversation progress, not at the moment. It feels to me like a lot of the conversation is very focused on what product is being advertised. So instead of advertising agencies putting their creative heft behind fossil fuel industries, or advertising cheap flights, advertising SUVs, advertising fast food companies, etc. There's commitments being made to not support those companies and to instead support other supposedly kind of less carbon heavy industries. That kind of completely bypasses the norming and social psychological effect of advertising. So if I give an example, an advertising agency that has really done a lot of kind of reflection, is thinking very deeply about their kind of influence in the world, might decide that they are only going to advertise electric cars. So lots of people would applaud that. They'd say, brilliant, that's advertising, really stepping up to the mark, like doing what it can do, etc. But if that electric car advert is still glamorizing and championing particular values that are extrinsic, the damage is the same in terms of our psyches, regardless of whether you've advertised an SUV or whether you've advertised an electric car. So quite often electric car adverts are really hedonistic or really sort of achievement focused. The underlying message is like, you're going to look really cool and sexy in our electric car. Everyone's going to think you're really awesome. It's still playing on that idea of like coolness and power and prestige and image, etc. So the product doesn't matter as much as the values that you are reinforcing. So I want the advertising industry to move the conversation along into that space and start talking about their cultural values footprint, not just their carbon footprint, although that is important and they should still be tracking and measuring that. I want them to start thinking about the ways of understanding the world that they are reinforcing, often really unintentionally, but it's through those deep values, those deep ways that we understand the world, that certain pathways to social and environmental healing get completely cut off to us. They're just not even possible. We're not having those conversations at all. So that's my first thing. My second thing is more for individuals. So, that student yesterday who came and asked me, there's something there that I want to say, what's your real motivation? Are you motivated to go into advertising because you love creativity? You're a really creative person. You love the process of design, of kind of taking a concept through to creation, etc. There are other careers out there where you can utilize those skills. And some of them really closely linked to social and environmental justice. God knows we need more creative people in the social and environmental justice fields. Or are you motivated by the kind of, you've seen Mad Men, you're motivated by the rich, glamorous, status-fueled lifestyle of being an advertiser? I'm not trying to shame those people. We're told all the time that is the world that we should have. That is the life. That is the good life. That is what we should be aiming for. So I'm not shaming those people. I'm just saying that if that isn't your motivation, there are other ways that you can utilize your creative gifts that aren't selling a product, but are actually maybe trying to shift the values that we're prioritizing culturally.
Now, Ruth, we are sadly coming towards the end of our time, but I did just want to ask you one more question specifically about outdoor advertising, actually, because Common Cause Foundation released an influential report back in 2011 now called Think of Me as Evil. Again, we'll put a link to that for listeners. It looked at ethical considerations in advertising, and it made some recommendations, including restricting advertising to children and ending advertising in public space, where we have no choice but to see advertising, we have not consented to it being there. So today we have looked mainly at TV adverts, apart from the Stormzy billboard one. But billboard ads do similarly tap into cultural values. Can you say anything about that? Do you think we need to remove outdoor advertising to reduce its impact? And what about other types of advertising?
Yeah, I mean, if I was Prime Minister for the day, I'd remove outdoor advertising like in a heartbeat. The only real negative kind of implication of removing outdoor advertising is to the profits of the companies that are advertising, and I personally don't care that much about that. So for me, outdoor advertising, I'm excited by the possibility of what you do with that space when that space isn't being paid for and kind of co-opted by, whichever company has decided that it has a target audience in that area and it wants to influence them. For me, I'm really interested in projects where local communities are able to buy back or somehow kind of secure ownership of outdoor advertising space, because what we tend to find is that then the messages, the narratives that kind of get represented, the values that get reinforced through what is then designed are often very intrinsic. So a community decide to showcase local art from local school children, or they decide to paint some sort of mural that talks about the identity of that community as being one of like welcome and caring, etc. So you have an opportunity not even just to sort of diminish the reach of extrinsic values by getting rid of outdoor advertising, but you have this really interesting opportunity to increase and strengthen our exposure to intrinsic ones by creating interesting different types of messaging, utilizing that space. So that for me just feels super exciting. Any way that we can diminish extrinsic and strengthen the importance of intrinsic values just feels like something to me that we absolutely should be doing. In terms of other types of advertising, it's a really difficult one, and I think they're, to the extent that I wish our world was different and that we lived in a totally different setup, a different kind of governing system, a different economic structure, etc., we don't. We live in the world as it is now. And so there is something about finding ways to improve what we have, to tweak what exists, to be less damaging and hopefully have some more positive impact. But that doesn't come at the expense of having the deeper conversations that we have to have about the ongoing implications of the way that we are living on our planet. There is something about improving advertising where it exists. So ensuring that advertising organizations, the clients that they are working with, are living in alignment with the intrinsic values that they are kind of promoting. Fine, but we need a larger conversation about the position of advertising, the fact that we have built an economy and a way of living that is about us constantly feeling unworthy, and that we need to buy all the time for our entire lives to try to gain some sort of feeling of value, personal value. So I don't think I would ever see a campaign that was trying to get rid of any type of advertising and feel that probably doesn't have really positive impacts. But obviously the campaigners that are working on trying to curtail the influence of advertising are minuscule in comparison to the unbelievable might of the advertising industry. So there is a degree of kind of reality that we also have to deal with, unfortunately.
Ruth, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you. I've really enjoyed this fascinating conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, I've really enjoyed it. Thanks very much.
Thanks for listening to Better Without Billboards. If you want to hear more from Ruth, you can sign up to her Substack newsletter, Culture Soup. And you can catch up with all the previous episodes of the podcast on YouTube, Acast, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Thanks, and see you next time.